Plants are all around us, but many species across the world are also disappearing. With growing interest in conservation, there's also been growing interest among ethnobotanists of the relationships between cultural traditions, cultural uses of plants, and the conservation of biological diversity. The area of ethnobotany that deals with these relationships is known as ethnoecology. Now, ecology, of course, is the study of organisms and their interactions with each other and with all of their components in the environment. And ethnoecology, then, is the study of interactions between human cultures and their local environments. The elements necessary for understanding ethnoecological relationships are the same as those that are necessary for understanding any ecological relationship. So, for instance, if I was interested in understanding pollination of this sunflower by a butterfly, I would first need to understand the butterfly, the behavior of the butterfly, and the biology of the butterfly. I'd need to understand the biology of the plant and the way it grows and flowers, etc., its flowering biology. And of course, I need to understand the relationships. And the same goes for ethnoecology, to understand the relationships between people and their environments. We need to understand something about humans and human cultures. We need to understand something about the biology of the environment, and we need to understand how those two things interact. So the big questions that we look at in ethnoecology include: how do people perceive of their environment? How do they view it? What do they know about their environment? How do people use their environment? So then how do people take that knowledge of the environment and act on it? Right? How do they use their natural resources? What are the management practices they have? And the third question is, okay, well, what are the ecological implications, right? What are the impacts of those two things above for biological conservation? I'm going to talk very briefly about these first two questions, and then focus the rest of this episode on the third question. How do people perceive of their environment? Well, one of the ways in which we can try to understand this is by looking at traditional ecological knowledge. Now, traditional ecological knowledge is any ecological knowledge held by traditional peoples of their environment. And it includes a wide range of things. So, for instance, traditional ecological knowledge includes knowledge of all the plants and the animals that live in the area, their interactions with each other, which ones are dispersed by animals, which ones are pollinated, why plants grow well in certain areas, why they don't, how they grow, their flowering seasons, their fruiting seasons, the relationships to rain and weather patterns, interannual variability, etc., etc., etc. It's all this ecological knowledge of the environment. Ecological knowledge of land and plants and animals, though, is of course embedded. It doesn't just exist by itself. It's embedded within land resource management systems. So the ways in which people, the knowledge that people have of the environment is embedded in the ways in which they manage the environment. And the ways in which they manage the environment are embedded within social institutions of the culture. Now, what I mean by social institutions are rules and regulations, local rules and regulations. I'm not talking about government organizations or government institutions. Local rules, cultural rules and regulations that act to govern the ways in which people act on the environment. So, a great example of this, of course, is the kapu system or taboos in general. And of course, these social institutions then are embedded within cultural worldviews, that's belief systems. So, when we think about traditional ecological knowledge and try to understand it, we need to understand that it's not right there for outsiders to take out. It's embedded very deeply within all these different layers within the culture. So the kinds of places in which ecological knowledge is encoded is very different from the places in which ecological knowledge that you're learning here at the university is encoded, like textbooks. Rather, traditional ecological knowledge is encoded in things like plant names. For instance, plants can be named according to some ecological interactions, like a flower can be named flower that's visited by a hummingbird. It's a flower that has nectar that the hummingbird eats. The traditional ecological knowledge may be encoded in ceremonies. It may only come out in certain ceremonies when you need to talk about it. In some kinds of ceremonies, people will name the different kinds of plants and animals in that region. It's embedded in chants, certainly, and in dance as well. And in Hawaii hula is an excellent example of a dance in which much traditional ecological knowledge is encoded, knowledge descriptions of the environment of plants and animals, or I should, birds and flowers, etc. in the environment, knowledge of agricultural practices as well, of planting taro, etc. So all these different ways in which places, I should say, or in which traditional ecological knowledge is encoded. How do people use their environment? How do people then use this ecological knowledge? How do people's perceptions of their environment then shape how they use it? We can look at how people use their environment by then looking at land and resource management systems that are based on the ecological knowledge and perceptions. And these include both agricultural systems, so the ways in which people plant their crops. So we could look at lo'i or taro patches here. In Hawaii, we could look at dryland farming of uala or sweet potato, try to understand the way those work. These are traditional agricultural practices. Traditional resource management practices also include the management of wild resources. So how are wild plants harvested? How are trees cut down for different uses? And how are agro-ecosystems maintained? Now, an agro-ecosystem is an ecosystem that contains both agricultural lands and wild lands mixed together. And this is very common. And indigenous peoples will often manage these agro-ecosystems where agricultural and wild patches, of course, are fundamentally related to each other through local management practices. Okay, and so the third question is, okay, what are the ecological impacts of the ways in which people use their environment, the ways in which people perceive of their environment? And that looking at those impacts allows us to ask, okay, what is the relationship between traditional uses of plants and the conservation of biodiversity? And this is a fundamental question that I want to address right now. One of the things that we need to know right off the bat when we look at this question is physically the relationships between indigenous cultures and areas of high biodiversity on Earth. And we can see that by looking at this map. Now, the different colors are the major terrestrial habitat types in the world. And we can see where the diversity in the world is contained within these habitats, and we can see the habitats on the map. All the little black dots represent ethno-linguistic groups. And what we can see here is that lots of those little black dots occur in the same places of the areas of highest biodiversity, that is, the areas where the colors are. So most areas of high biodiversity are inhabited today by indigenous peoples. So that's something that we need to know right now from the start. So before we delve into looking at the relationships between traditional uses of plants and the conservation of biodiversity, let's just look very briefly at the Western conservation models that have been used over the past few centuries, okay, past couple of centuries. And think about what the assumptions in these conservation models are. Now, probably the most popular conservation model, and the one that you're all familiar with, are those of parks and protected areas. Now, parks and protected areas were originally, many of them were originally created as colonial reserves, as areas to protect watersheds, also to protect timber, to protect big game, etc. And generally they are government declared, and they involve moving people out of that land that becomes a park. So examples are Hawaii Volcano National Park is a national park, Ka'ala Natural Reserve, natural reserve as well, etc. A second type of conservation model is nature purchases from private owners, and this is where a private owner could come, buy a whole area of land, and then decide to preserve it. And an example of this is Guanacaste National Park in Costa Rica. Any of you who have been to Costa Rica, you may be familiar with this place. A third one is debt for nature swaps. In this model, a proportion of a country's debt is purchased or is waived in exchange for setting aside a conservation area. Sometimes people are removed, but other times they're allowed to stay. One thing I should mention was that in the nature purchases from private owners, of course, this is private land, and most of the time people are removed from the land. Example of a debt for nature swap is Monteverde forest in Costa Rica. And a fourth example of this are carbon sequestration projects. Now, with the concern of global warming, there's been efforts across the world to decrease production of carbon dioxide, and there's been agreements, like the Kyoto Agreement, of course, which has not been signed by the United States, agreements made between countries to try reduce levels of carbon dioxide over time. Now, one of the options for, let's say, companies that are producing more than they're supposed to be is that they can, even though they're producing over, they can effectively reduce it by investing in conserving forests that can take up that extra carbon dioxide produced. So instead, the idea here is that instead of having local governments pay to make protected areas, here you're having companies or countries that are producing excess carbon dioxide paying to preserve forests that can then take that up. Example of this is Zamboro National Park in Bolivia, which actually preserves a huge diversity of birds. The point of talking about all this is that these are the Western conservation models that are used, although there are other ones now as well. But what they have in common is that they're all designed to preserve biodiversity and exclude human diversity, human cultures, because by and large humans are removed from these areas. Now again, I should mention that because of the failure of many of these models in many parts of the world, they have changed, and at least over the past probably 20 years they've been changing to allow for various levels of human involvement. So again, Western conservation models that are based on certain assumptions about the relationships of traditional cultures to the conservation of resources. In particular, they're based on one of two very common myths or oversimplifications about these relationships. And I want to talk a little bit about these two myths right now. The first myth is, again, the one that these Western conservation models, many of them are based on, and it's known as the intruding wastrel. Basically, this myth says that indigenous and traditional peoples inevitably end up destroying nature, that people and nature are simply not compatible. The idea is that in the past, they may have been compatible because population densities were very low, so people couldn't do too much harm, but simply as populations increase, they inevitably end up destroying resources. The second myth, or oversimplification, is known as the exotic or noble other, and this is the exact opposite. The idea in this oversimplification is that all indigenous people and traditional peoples are conservationists. They all live in harmony with nature, and they always have, and they always will, and they conserve all their resources. So let's examine both myths now, and in a little detail. One of the ways in which we can look at if this is true or not, that is, the myth or the idea that people are always destroying nature, is to ask, okay, can traditional resource management systems act to conserve biodiversity? Are there ways in which these two things are compatible? Well, when we look at traditional management systems across the globe, we find that yes, there are several ways, there are various ways in which these two things are compatible, and in fact, many of these are common to multiple regions of the world. So, for example, in many places of the world, traditional management practices include the total protection of certain biological communities. So these include, for instance, sacred groves, where people are not allowed to harvest or cut or do the kinds of things that they would do outside of them. These sacred groves could be a variety of things. They could be sacred forests. There's sacred forests in many parts of the world. They could be pools. They could be river courses. They could be meadows. They could be entire valleys as well. So this type of traditional management practice is actually very similar to one of the Western conservation models, where people are not allowed to act on them. A second practice that is again common to many cultures is the protection of all individuals of a certain species of plant or animal. Now, in terms of plants, what's interesting about this is that many of the plants that have this status are what in ecology we might call keystone species. They're those species that play really important roles in the local ecology because they serve a multitude of functions. They can provide food for a whole bunch of different animals, all sorts of fruits. They could provide shelter for many other things. They could provide hiding places. They could provide the certain microclimates where things can germinate. They can have epiphytes growing on them, etc. So examples of these kinds of species include Ficus religiosa, which you're going to hear about later in another episode, its relationship to religion, and Ceiba pedantra, which is here on UH campus as well, but native to Mexico and Central America. Both these species are examples of keystone species. They play very important roles in the ecosystems in which they're from, and they're sacred trees and are not cut down. And interestingly, in fact, if you go to Central America today, you'll find that most of the rainforest is indeed cut down, or large areas of it. But even where you have huge, extensive areas of cattle pasture, you'll always see giant ceiba trees, and that's because the people there still don't cut them down. Another traditional management practice that's, again, very common across many cultures and that acts to conserve biodiversity is the protection of certain stage classes of a species. And this could be when, for instance, in terms of animals, it could be when they're reproducing. In terms of fish, very common when they're spawning. In terms of plants, it could be when the plants are very small, you're not allowed to harvest little ones, like you need to allow them to grow up, etc. And one of the most important ways in which this is carried out is through taboos, and people have done studies looking at the role of taboos, in fact, and the relationships to conservation. I put this slide up just as an example, and for any of you who are interested, you can follow the reference that's at the bottom. Certainly in Hawaii, the kapu system acted in many ways to protect individuals of certain species, and certainly to protect certain stage classes, to protect things at a certain time of year, etc. So these are all ways in which traditional management practices act to conserve biodiversity. A fourth way in which is talked about as a traditional practice that can help conserve biodiversity is the practice of group harvests. And the idea here is that group level assessments of the status of animals can act as a way of regulating, making sure that everybody can see the numbers that are there, and regulating and ensuring the maintenance of those populations. Okay, so it seems pretty clear that yes, there are a variety of ways in which traditional management practices certainly do and can act to conserve biodiversity. What about ways in which traditional resource management is consistent with the enhancement of biodiversity? And when we look at the literature and we look at examples across the world, we find again that yes, there are many ways in which these two things are compatible or consistent. For instance, many traditional practices involve the creation of patchiness in the landscape. By patchiness, I mean different kinds of vegetation, different kinds of systems within a landscape. And this is often carried out through fire management, traditional fire management. For instance, if you can imagine a forest that's full of trees of similar ages, and you come in and you burn a certain area, but not the whole thing, you burn a patch of that patch is then going to start to regenerate with different kinds of species of plants that will bring in different kinds of species of animals, etc. And you get a patchiness, you get different kinds of ecosystems, different kinds of communities within that landscape. That increases overall diversity, and of course, people do it because it increases that diversity of plants that are useful to people, and particularly people do it to increase food plants that often come up in these open areas. Creation of forest patches can be done in different ways as well. Or I should say the creation of patchiness can be done in different ways as well. And that, for instance, is through the creation by people of forest patches. And an example of this comes from the Kayapo people of Brazil, who live in savanna. And they use and create mounds of earth where they create these mounds of earth and they plant plants in them that become these little forest patches. And the ethnobotanist who first discovered this only became aware of it in his 7th year of fieldwork. Before that, he just assumed they were natural areas of forest. People can enhance biodiversity through planting, through managing in their fallow systems. And in many different places, once land is farmed, it's then left to go fallow. It's left to not plant anymore, and it's left to repose and regenerate. And while the ecological process is going on, people often manage it. They plant certain trees, they might spare certain trees, they weed, they favor certain plants that may have fruits on it that attract animals, so the animals can come in and then they could hunt those animals as well. And when you compare the diversity of fallows that just recuperate naturally on their own to those that are managed by people, often you will find that those that are managed have a higher biodiversity. And finally, enhancement has been shown to occur through things like cycling migrations of nomadic people. This is really interesting. An example comes from Kenya, where the Turkana nomadic people have been blamed for centuries for overgrazing and causing desertification. The large-scale movements of these people follow the rains, and they mimic the migrations of the wild ungulates like gazelles and wildebeest. They of course follow the rains because they follow the new grass that comes up after the rains. What people have found, however, is that seedlings of acacia, which is the dominant tree species of the woodlands, often appear in the raising season after these pastoralists have abandoned the areas and where they have been. The seeds are an important part of the diet, and some are not digested. And these that are not digested germinate in areas where the livestock have been, where they're very fertile because of the manure, and they germinate much faster than they would if under normal conditions, something like 85 times more faster. So the idea here is that because people are moving through the landscape with their animals, that having their animals in these areas actually increases the fertility and allows for the greater germination of these species, which then go on to create woodlands. So, but the migrations of these people are actually I should mention that people have looked at the migrations and then have looked at the development of these patches and found correlations. So the idea here is that the pastoralists are actually improving rangelands through the creation of these forest patches or woodland patches. Okay, so not just management of wild resources can enhance biodiversity, but traditional agricultural practices can as well. And we've talked about this before. So the great number of cultivars that people select over time, of course, leads to an increase in genetic diversity. Home gardens and the agricultural practices that people carry out in them, the number of cultivars, the number of species that people have there, also allow for high levels of biodiversity, both of the plants that people are cultivating, but also of the animals that come in and eat the plants and disperse and pollinate, etc. So it seems quite clear then when we look across the world that yes, some traditional management practices certainly can conserve biodiversity and certainly can enhance biodiversity. Now, if this is true, what are some of the consequences of excluding indigenous people from conservation areas? Is it always true that leaving people out of areas is going to improve their conservation? Well, in some cases this certainly may be true, and in other cases, though, it is proved not to be true. One example is the conflict between taro farmers and Fish and Wildlife on Kauai, where Fish and Wildlife have tried to build a sanctuary to protect waterbirds, while the taro farmers in that area maintain that they are protecting waterbirds through the taro farms. Recently, there was a student who did a study and was able to show that indeed the taro farms really well protected the native water birds. And in fact, when you look at the historical record, people have shown that when the first Hawaiians actually came to Hawaii, the first Polynesians came to Hawaii, they opened up a lot of land, a lot of forest to create lo'i or taro patches. And while this, of course, led to the destruction of those forest areas, it created more habitat for native birds, native water birds. So, in fact, the lo'i or the taro patches was better for native water birds than having the forest there because, of course, the open water areas are their habitat. Another very famous example comes from Masai Mara National Reserve in Kenya, where the Masai people who have been living in that area for a very long period were removed when the reserve was set up. The idea was that by removing them, they would, the ecological conditions of the park would improve. What they found was not that, though. Despite the fact that it had been believed that traditional herding practices by the Maasai were detrimental to wild population of ungulates, this didn't seem to be true. People found, after having removed them, that herding may be beneficial to maintaining their habitats. And that's because the high-quality grasses for the ungulates are stimulated by partial grazing of the cattle, and in fact may be necessary for the survival. Ticks and wildfires increased once Maasai were prohibited from controlled burning, as they used to do. And wild animals avoided unpalatable grass and the unmanaged pastures. So again, these were some of the consequences of removing people from an area where they had been living for a very long period of time. A third example I'll give you comes from indigenous farmers, or O'odham farmers, on the Mexico-U.S. border. These farmers had their traditional homesteads there. The Fish and Wildlife Service came in and decided to put a bird sanctuary there to protect the bird diversity on the U.S. side, but of course nothing was done on the Mexican side. A number of years after, an ethnobotanist did a study to look and compare the diversity of birds on the O'odham, the indigenous farming homesteads, and across the border in the bird sanctuary. And what they found was, in fact, bird diversity was higher on the Mexican side in the traditional homesteads. So this is not to say that removing people from the land is always going to lead to worse situations. Removing people could certainly lead to much better situations. The point is that this is not always the case. So traditional management practices can act, some of them at least, to conserve species populations, to conserve and maintain ecological processes, and in places where people have co-evolved, especially co-evolved over long periods with other elements of the environment, excluding them could disrupt the ecological balance. And finally, cultural practices can enhance species diversity. Okay? So I think we can then say that the idea that people are simply going to destroy the environment is certainly an oversimplification. It certainly may be true in numerous cases, but we cannot say that it's fundamentally and always true. We've got many examples of cases where it's not. Now let's examine the other myth, or oversimplification, which is again the opposite, and that is that indigenous and traditional peoples are always conserving the environment, or always in harmony in the environment. And again, if we look across the earth, we look in cultures across the earth, we find that no, this is of course not true. There are many, many examples of indigenous and other traditional peoples destroying the environment. There are many examples around the world of overharvest of mammals around human communities. There's examples, too, of how cultures change over time, that it's cultures who are new to a certain area. When humans arrive in a new area, they don't understand the ecosystems, they haven't developed traditional ecological knowledge of that area yet, they don't understand the feedbacks, and they can act to deplete the resources on the environment. Over time, however, they can then learn, they gain knowledge of the environment, they change their practices, they adapt, and they can develop practices that are very compatible with conservation. So, again, cultures can be very destructive in the beginning, and over time that can change. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of destruction carried out by people may be indirect as well. So an example is that in a lot of the Pacific Islands, humans are often thought to have caused large extinction of birds. This may be true. Another hypothesis is that the extinction of birds came in large part indirectly because of the rats that came on the canoes in which the people came. But certainly there's examples across the world of indigenous and traditionalist people depleting their resources, and this goes back over thousands of years. So I think the myth of indigenous people always being in harmony with the environment is really exemplified by the story of Chief Seattle and what he was purported to say. Now, in the 1950s, Washington Territory was created, and the government was negotiating a treaty with the native people. A gathering of the Duwamish was called in 1854. The government explained its plans to conclude the treaty, and Chief Seattle of the Duwamish was then responded with a speech of his own. Now, apparently, someone there in the audience listened and was really moved by the speech, and he recorded it. But when he recorded it, he embellished it and apparently added things on his own. Later, the speech was made into in the 70s. A movie was made of the speech, and new parts were still added. And so, as it turns out, what we often read that Chief Seattle said is not actually what he said. And the differences between what he was purported to say and what he said are really illustrative of the point I want to make today, and that is the differences in the ways in which in the West we may view conservation and indigenous people and the views of indigenous peoples. What Chief Seattle is purported to have said is, all things are connected, and if all the beasts were gone, men would die from a great loneliness of spirit, for whatever happens to beasts soon happens to man. However, apparently he did not say these things. What he did say, among other things, was, every part of the county is sacred to my people. Every hillside, every valley, every plain, and every grove has been hallowed by some fond memory or some sad experience by my tribe. And I want you to think now about the differences between those two sets of statements, because they are fundamentally different. What's sacred here is the relationship, in what Chief Seattle is saying here, is the relationship. The land has meaning because of its relationship to his people. The land is described in terms of what it means to his culture, in his cultural history. That is, again, what is sacred is the interaction. So, there's really fundamentally different concepts of human-nature relationships, often between indigenous cultures and between Western conservation ideas. So even though the outcomes of resource management systems by indigenous and traditional peoples may be really similar to what Western conservationists desire, and we've just demonstrated that can be very true, we need to also understand that they can differ, as Frederick Burks writes in his book, Sacred Ecology, which I would recommend to anybody who's interested in this topic. They differ in context and motive and in conceptual underpinnings. So while in the West, humans are considered outside of nature, in fact, the concept of wilderness is in fact described as that. 1964 U.S. Wilderness Act describes wilderness as a place where man himself is a visitor and does not remain. Conservation has been described by conservation biologists as conserving the full set of species, genetic variation within these species, the variety of all the ecosystems that contain the species, and the natural gene frequencies and the natural abundances in which these occur, all of this without people. So again, on Western conservation models, humans really are outside of nature. The perspectives of many indigenous cultures stands in opposition to this. That is, biodiversity and humans are fundamentally interrelated, and that one simply cannot exist without the other. In many indigenous cultures, the idea exists that the land needs the people to keep it living, just as people need the land to keep living. And in fact, a philosophy that is shared among many peoples is something that can be called, as one ethnobotanist puts it, keeping it living. That is a concern that is not for preservation of all the species, but to keep the system itself living. So when we think about the relationships between traditional peoples and conservation of natural resources, we need to realize that we can't fall into these myths or stereotypes or oversimplifications because they're not true. that certainly people can conserve biodiversity and they can also destroy it. That the relationship varies greatly from place to place, and it varies greatly over time. However, what we can say is that indigenous cultures are fundamentally connected to biodiversity, and we can see that simply on the map by the places in which they live. And that if cultural practices help to maintain biodiversity, and we certainly know that some of them do, then to conserve biodiversity, we need to conserve those cultural practices. And if cultural practices depend on biodiversity, and from the other episodes of this course, you certainly know that as well, then we need to conserve biodiversity in order to conserve the cultures. So finally, take-home messages and key concepts is that common assumptions about the relationships between cultural uses of resources and conservation are based on several myths. Cultural uses of resources can both deplete biodiversity and enhance and conserve it. The relationship between resource use and conservation varies greatly over time and changes across cultures. Modern conservation programs in the West and traditional resource management systems often have similar outcomes, but they are based on very different concepts. And finally, human cultures shape their environment, and human cultures are also shaped by their environment. So the conservation of cultures and of natural resources are fundamentally interconnected.